Got ourselves sorted out. Welcome. I'm Tony Burns. I'm one of the co-directors for the Centre for the Study of Social and Global Justice. I'm going to chair this evening's session. Andy is going to give us another lecture on Capital Volume 2. I think it's lecture 6 on chapters 12 and 13, if I remember correctly, from just a minute ago. So my goldfish memory. So he's going to lecture for usual 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have half an hour or so for discussion, and we'll finish at 7:30. Okay, so Andy, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tony. It's lecture 6 and chapter 16 and 17, in fact. And this is sort of a crunch point, really. It's in the middle of the book. And I'm going to look at chapter 16, which is entitled The Turnover of Capital, Variable Capital. But actually, this is the chapter where we finally get to surplus value. So it is quite a very important chapter, in my view. And it's an important link to volume 3 of Capital. Chapter 17, I'll also talk about in a slightly more wide-ranging sort of way, the nature of the chapter. So a lot of the text is almost like notes, and it's less tight, it's less analytical, more discursive. The big issue with chapter 17 is, again, the title is slightly misleading, because what Marx writes about a lot is the circulation of money. Could you please mute yourselves, if you don't mind? Okay, thank you. All right. So surplus value, circulation of surplus value, and its conversion into money. And I want to say something about how David Harvey presents this, right? So if we just do a review quickly, what we looked at before, and this is sort of just a reminder, is that Marx makes a very big breakthrough in his conceptual distinction between constant capital and variable capital. Because variable capital is exchanged with the commodity form of the workers, basically, their labor power, and that's the source of new value. And this is a break from previous political economy. Previous political economy reduced into the same category, basically, labor and raw materials, insofar as it had a distinction. It was between circulating and fixed capital. Although that distinction was quite confused, and Marx goes, some length in explaining Smith, in particular Adam Smith's confusions. So for Marx, within circulating capital, there are two elements. One is the raw materials and the ancillaries, which he calls the object of labor, and the other is the wages that are paid to the workers. There's a part of capital which is in advance to buy labor power. And so within circulating capital, there are both constant capital, whose value is transferred to the commodity product, and variable capital, which is what sets in motion the labor power, which creates new value. So this is a big breakthrough, basically. And so the distinction between labor and labor power comes in here. Now, if we look at chapter 15, which is the last one we looked at, this is a bit more technical. It's not as, once you get used to what Marx is doing, he's looking at circulation time, and he's looking at the effect of increasing circulation time, what it means in terms of how much capital needs to be advanced in order to keep continuous production going. And Marx uses this example, which we sort of walked through, where you have a production period, or a working period, as he often says at this point, of 9 weeks. So there's a capital spend to keep production moving of £100 a week over 9 weeks. So that's £900. But if it takes 3 weeks to sell what's been produced, so the overall cycle here is a 12-week period, but 3 weeks of that, the commodities are finished, but they're not yet sold. So the capitalist is waiting for the money value, the money form of the value, to come back. So in order to keep production going, they have to put out more money, outlay more money to keep production going. And so for 3 weeks, you have this sort of overlap between the first cycle, the first batch, if you like, and the second batch. And Marx follows this through with a sort of a repeating cycle through the year. So what happens is basically is more capital needs to be advanced than if there was no circulation period at all. If it's just purely continuous production, there's an overhead, if you like, that the capitalist has to carry to keep his production going. Now, Marx does point to another option, which is the other way the capitalist could do it is if they haven't got this extra £300, which they need to keep production going again, is if they've only got £900 to advance, then the only other way they could do this in the context of continuous production is just to reduce the scale of production. So in other words, they produce at 3/4 of the rate, and then they can have their £900 would stretch over 12 weeks, basically. And that's his, that's a trade-off, if you like, for any given capitalist. Right. Now we come to the term.
Credit borrowing. Anyway, yeah. Okay.
Now we come. Could you possibly mute that person, please, Tony? Or it's really keep asking for this. The turnover of variable capital. Right. So what Marx does here is he brings in his distinction within circulating capital of variable capital and constant capital. So this is the new material, right? So he says, okay, let's say we've got £500 circulating capital each week, and let's say £400 of that is on raw materials and ancillaries, and £100 is paying the workers, the variable capital. So that's £500 each week to keep production going, but with a distinction now between the constant and the variable. And what Marx in this example tells us is the turnover period consists of 4 weeks of production and 1 week of circulation. So here we have in the diagram exactly that. Now, each week, the capitalist will advance another £500 until the end of the 4 weeks, and they've finished. That commodity is produced. It's not yet sold, but it's finished as a use value. It's only now needs to be exchanged. So what we have now for the continuous production, as the earlier example he gave us, is a new batch, if you like, of production takes place while the first batch is waiting to be sold. And in week 5, after another week, it is sold. And that's when money comes back in, and money will come back in after week 5, after week 9, and so on. Okay, so this is an interesting thing. There's a slight nuance here, because what's happening is that every 4th week there's £2,000 worth of variable and constant capital, right? So we haven't yet got the surplus value. We're just looking at the variable and constant capital. So that's £2,000 every 4 weeks, 4 times 500. So if that's 12.5 weeks in a 50-week year, that adds up to 2,500. But the other way of looking at this, 25,000, sorry, is to think of it as a turnover of 10 times 2.5, 2,500. So it's what I would say, this is like a trump door. It all depends which way you look at it, what you see here. But the net result is the same. Over the year, there is a transfer of value of 25,000 because it's 50 weeks at £500 a week. And you can see this sort of, there's a sort of flow out of capitalist money into production, circulating capital, commodities are produced, then after a week they're sold. There's a reflux, the term Marx uses, of the money coming back, and this is a cyclical movement. Okay, so the value transferred to the annual product in this example is £25,000. Now Marx does bring in surplus value, and he sort of strips out his constant capital and just looks at variable capital and surplus value. And as a very normal sort of ratio Marx uses, he's saying, well, let's say that the rate of surplus value is 100%. So that in every week, every day, sorry, that there's no, every week there's £100 laid out. There will also be the workers will produce a surplus value in the commodity form worth £100. So what we have now is at week 4, just with these two elements, every week there's been £200 a value produced, new value produced. So at the end of 4 weeks, that will be £800. But once again, we have to wait a week until the commodities are sold and the money comes back. So we have a very similar sort of diagram here, except now we're just looking at surplus value and variable capital. Once again, every 4 weeks, we get the money coming back. And there's a sort of a what's the word? It's like an iterative loop, basically. Now, sorry, I'll just point out. So Marx has stripped out constant capital, and he's just looking at that component of value of the commodity product, which we've become accustomed in his notation as V plus S, the variable capital and the surplus value. Okay, so the surplus value now is explicitly circulating alongside the variable capital. So what Marx now does is he looks at the effect of turnover. And again, he simplifies his example to bring out this particular effect. This is Marx's use of abstraction, if you like, with controlling the variables, just looking at one variable one at a time. And so he takes away the circulation period. We don't have a week anymore now waiting to be sold. Let's suppose that it takes 5 weeks to produce these commodities in production with no waiting around. So that means that the surplus value, again, is being produced at a rate of £100 a week. And at the same time, we've got a variable capital transferred. So that's £200 a week over 5 weeks. The V plus S of these commodities is £1,000. Okay, again, he's stripped out constant circulating capital, right? And so it will go on every 5 weeks, the commodities are sold for £1,000. So the constraint on the turnover time here is not to do with circulation time. It's to do with how long does it take to produce this stuff. The turnover time is entirely in production. So, okay, so then he looks at this and he says, well, what's happening here is we've got a situation where we're producing every week for 50 weeks of the year, and what we're producing every week is a value of £200, right? Let me get my figures exactly right. Yeah, so we've got variable capital, yeah, £200. So what's the total? In one sense, the variable capital is £100 every week for 50 weeks. That would be £5,000. Or you could see it as we sell 10 times during the year, and each time it's £500 of variable capital. But what Marx makes a distinction now, and this is a crucial point, it's an analytical point, right? Which is the difference between the variable capital which circulates and the, if you like, the aggregate effect of the variable capital over the year. And so we know that the variable capital advanced, it becomes less and less the faster the turnover. The more turnover there is, the capitalists can get back the money quicker, and they don't need to advance so much money before they get the money back, basically. So the variable capital advanced is only £500 because it just keeps coming back when the goods are sold, right? Okay. Now, what's the rate of surplus value? The rate of surplus value we're very familiar with is S over V, which is the surplus value produced over the variable capital that it took the capitalist to pay for the workers to produce it. This ratio is, as I say, very consistently, Marx uses the ratio of 100%. And so far, so good. If you look within this period, it looks fine, right? You've got within 5 weeks, there's been a production worth £1,000, £500 of which is surplus value, £500 of which was variable capital, 500 over 500, 100%. Okay, but when it comes to the annual rate of surplus value, there's a further mediation, as Marx would call it, a further sort of layer of complexity, right? Because the annual rate of surplus value is the annual surplus value divided by the capital advanced. But the annual surplus value now is 10 times 500. So you've got this over a year rather than over one production period. This will keep adding up to £5,000, right? But the capital advanced is still just this 5 weeks worth, okay, which was £500. So what you've got is a new concept which Marx introduces, because he's bringing in the time element into the concept of the rate of surplus value. So what he's saying is the annual rate of surplus value is the normal rate of surplus value, if you like, times the number of turnovers in a year. So the more turnovers there are, the higher will be the annual rate of surplus value. Okay, so this example at the moment, we've got a 1000% rate of surplus value, because it's not because the surplus value is any more, it's because the variable capital necessary, or if you like, expended advance to get this surplus value is much less the more there is turnover. The shorter the turnover increases the rate of annual rate of surplus value. It's not because there's more surplus value, it's because there's less variable capital. Now, Marx calls this case A, and he illustrates the point with a case B. Case B is very much very straightforward. There's only one turnover a year, so the stuff is produced, but it's not sold till the end of the year. So the workers are still employed at the same degree of exploitation. It's £100 a week for 50 weeks of surplus value that they produce. Now, the capital advanced is £5,000, because now the capitalist has to expend £100 for 50 weeks. Now, the surplus value hasn't changed. What's changed in terms of addressing the annual rate of surplus value is not how much surplus value the workers have produced, but how much variable capital it's taken to get them to produce it. And that's gone up, because that's gone up from £500 to £5,000. So we're back again to sort of like a unity of concept, if you like, without really the turnover coming into play, because it's just assumed there's a unity between the time period and the turnover period, right? The profit. I mean, the rate of surplus value period is 1 year, the turnover is 1 year. Okay, so the number of turnovers is sort of assumed out of it being a factor, right? But what we've got here now is the faster the turnover, the less capital needs to be advanced as variable capital, the higher is the annualized rate of surplus value. Now, you might ask why. I mean, so what? Why do we want to look at an annual rate of surplus value? And the answer is, it's very important stepping stone towards the concept of the rate of profit, because the rate of profit is conventionally an annual rate of profit. It's how much profit is made in a year. That is what the rate of profit is. It's not like the rate of profit in a minute or in 10 years, right? It's how much profit is made over the capital advanced in 1 year. So the faster the turnover for a given rate of surplus value, the higher will be the rate of profit. This is a really important result when we come to volume 3. Okay, and this is a breakthrough that Marx made, that he's the first one to be able to explain and understand this. Of course, rule of thumb capitalists would have some intuition that this is the case without any doubt, but in terms of explaining why it's the case, right? Now, the really big point here is that this is an effect of circulation. It's not an effect of the production of surplus value. It's an effect of how quickly the capital advance moves and turns over through circulation. So we've got a couple of reflections here. I think I've pretty much made these points. Annual rate of surplus value can be more or less according to inversely to the turnover. And it's not the surplus value that changes. It's not S, it's V. Okay. The amount of capital to buy up labor power and keep the workers in motion over the year. Right. All of this does follow, right? The annual rate of surplus value does coincide with the surplus value, which expresses the degree of exploitation in a single case when there's only one turnover in a year. This is obviously Marx, not me. Okay. Now, this reverts back to two parts of volume 1. The first is the general formula for capital, which everybody remembers now is money to commodities to more money, MCM dash, and also the question of simple reproduction. So what we've got is this idea of a circuit, a movement of capital through a circuit, but now we're thinking about it in terms of the movement of surplus value. So what Marx is telling us is this is all about how M becomes M dash, and circulation effects on the rate of profit. So it's both a reminder of what he, sort of outlined back in volume 1, but it's also an anticipation of how he's going to really go into this even more in volume 3. And one way of thinking about this is that the circulation process modifies how the essence appears, how the essential relation of exploitation actually appears on the surface. So it's a mediation. It's a step towards complete disguise of what's going on in essential terms. So the individual variable capital changes form. It goes from money of the capitalist into wages. The wages are used by the workers to buy their commodities, consume the commodities, and they active labor power. Right. Now, what Marx says here, and I'm not going to read it all out, is what this means is it takes capitalist B much longer to get their money back and to put it back into use as productive capital. So the form in which the value is held matters in that sense, right? The slowness or the quickness of the conversion of form makes a big difference to how available or not money is to the capitalists, right? So the rate of turnover is related to this very careful consideration that Marx began volume 2 with, of the movement of different changes of form. So it could be that the capital is tied up as a sort of, if it's in production, it's sort of like work in progress. It hasn't yet achieved even the commodity form. Or it could be that the form is, they are in the form of commodities, but they're not yet sold. They're awaiting sale, goods awaiting sale. So we can now begin to see all that winter training we put in part 1 is beginning to sort of like make perhaps hopefully more sense, right? So it's also appreciation of how sort of long range Marx thinking is, right? Now he extends this in terms of not only an individual capitalist, but the social point of view, right? And you can actually think about this in terms of any, we'll come on to any mode of production. So what he's saying here is £1 a week is a worker's salary. So if you've got 100 workers, that's £100 a week. Now, the worker is reproducing their own value product in capitalist A, and capitalist B, they have to wait a long time before they can be paid from their own product. So they're getting paid from another source rather than what they produce has been sold. That's the point he's making there. So the longer the production period is, especially with big projects, right? This is a long time to wait before the commodity is sold and there's a reflux. Now, Marx makes a big comment here about how this would be different in a communist society. It is not yet a communist society, but he's got, if you like, he prefigures, he conceptualizes what would take place, right? Society would have to reckon in advance. There's certain things, the way this works would be true of any society. It takes time to produce stuff, and it takes time once it's produced to get it somewhere to distribute it and consume it. But in a communist society, this could all be reckoned in advance and wouldn't have to be the plan of any individual capitalist, right? He's saying in capitalist society, what this does, especially this need to have money available while the commodities are still not sold and turned into money, this is generates the need to go to the money market. So once again, he keeps making this point in different ways, that from industrial capital, there's a need for a relationship with money, credit, and so on, right? So these are, one is the plan, and one is a planned solution to this problem, and the other is a market solution to the problem based on credit, right? So I'm going to be very careful about time. He does explain from this point, and I'm not going to explain this in detail here, but we'll study it, right? He does explain to some extent how this affects the industrial cycle. He goes into this more in volume 3, but But there's one thing I want to point out, because I do think David Harvey makes a big point of this quote, right? What Marx says at this point, right? He does start to talk about effective demand, right? On the one hand, you've got credit becoming available. On the other hand, there has to be an effective demand for the commodities that have been produced, right? And there's a footnote in Marx where he says, contradiction in the capitalist mode of production. The workers are important for the market as buyers of commodities, but as sellers of their commodity, labor power, capitalist society has the tendency to restrict them to their minimum price. So this we'll carry this forward, but I want you to make a note of this, and we'll come back to it. It's a significant quote, right? Which is that we're no longer only talking about workers in production as the producers of value and of surplus value, because we're looking, or Marx is taking us to look at circulation, the market. Then of course workers are also appear in the market. They have a wage, and they use their wage to buy stuff. Okay, so they are also, as well as sellers of labor power, they are buyers of commodities, and this puts them in a different relationship, a market relationship with capitalist producers. And this point is quite clearly about the movement towards scale. Marx makes a really, what's the word here? I think it's an incomplete point. It's an important point, but I don't think it's complete, right? He talks about how the distance from the market is going to increase turnover time, which again, you could think in almost any type of society that would be true. But of course, in a capitalist society, this has an effect on the market and market conditions, and the extent that credit is available. And Marx does make this point that English cotton sold to India is very prone to crisis conditions because of the length of time it takes for the money to return. And this is interesting from my point of view anyway, because he talks in a similar fashion back in volume 1 about the industrial nations and the agricultural nations, if you like, from the perspective of the developed capitalist mode of production. I think that this is incomplete because of colonialism, basically, and there's not a structural balance. And I do draw attention to the work of mostly Indian political economists, and the most important one is, in my view, that I've read anyway, is Utsa Patniak, and really explaining how, if you're looking at the movement of commodities, one thing, but if you look at the movement of money, it's another thing altogether. Because actually, the British kept hold of all the money just about from Indian exports. So you don't have, it is a colonial, say, imbalance, it'd be rather over polite, right? It was robbery, basically. There was a violent colonial transfer. So once the Indian commodities were sold in sterling, then the British just kept hold of the money and said that it was to expenses of empire, basically. So the Indians got robbed twice, is what I'm saying here. And this is quite important. We're not going to go into it yet, but this is important because the assumption of equal exchange, when you look at it from a colonized perspective of colonial relations, just doesn't hang true at all, right? There isn't an equal exchange. And this is also what happens with Marini writing from the perspective of Latin America, and Iaffa writing from the perspective of Africa. So it's a generalized issue about colonization does not mean equal exchange. So what I take from chapter 16 is very strong links forward to volume 3, and especially this idea of the conversion of the rate of surplus value to the annual rate of profit. And what Engels does is he does carry this forward. I think he makes one or two small mistakes, but basically he gets the concept right and he carries it forward. And I mean, and anticipating it, because this is important to realize why we have done all this winter and now spring training, right? Is that the rate of profit depends on 3 variables. One is the rate of surplus value. The second one is the number of turnovers. And the third one is the inverse of the organic composition of capital. So you have to look at all 3, even at the level of an individual capital, And I would argue also at the system level as well. And this is interesting. It's quite a technical point, but it actually is very significant, right? This also carries forward into volume 3 when Marx is doing the transformation problem, because what we've been working on all the way through volume 2 is there is a distinction between the capital advanced to set up production, which is subdivided, as we know, between fixed and circulating, and the capital used up, that's the capital transferred into the commodity product. They are distinct categories. They're not the same thing. So the price of production, which Mark looks at in volume 3, is the general rate of profit multiplied by the capital that has been advanced. Okay. And that's not the same as the general rate of profit times the capital used up, which is a very, very common mistake in the interpretive literature. And this is a very important conceptual distinction, because it's a qualitative difference. It's not just like, oh, let's assume they're the same and it's just simplifying the maths. It's a qualitative difference, right, in terms of what the transformation problem is all about. So there's a very important forward link. And in fact, it is quite surprisingly simple the way it falls out, but I'll speak about that when we get to volume 3. Just in terms of time, I am going to skip some things. I've already effectively already made this point. If you look at UK's trade with the US in this time, they used to ship gold between the two countries to balance off the trade. If there was more imports from Britain from the US, they would actually in the end pay by sending a ship with some gold on it over to New York, and vice versa. And this is completely not what happened when it comes to the UK and India, right? So as well as following the money, we have to follow how the money links up with commodities. And obviously beyond Marx's time, but of particular importance for people concerned about Britain, is the question of gold production was very important, as probably as big as India was for the British Empire by the beginning of the 20th century, was South Africa's gold production. Now, why am I saying this? Because I'm anticipating. So the question of moving gold around internationally was a real thing in Marx's time. It was not just nominal, it was a known thing that went on, right? The other big thing which affects Marx's views when we're coming on in a minute is there were a lot of debates at the time about monetary policy. In particular, the Ricardian view, Marx disputed it, and he says basically the amount of money in circulation depends basically on the value of commodities. That it's like the aggregate value of the commodities, the volume, and the value of each one, right? And so he has a sort of a commodity-led view about how much money is needed in circulation. And this was for him quite important because it was a critique of the Ricardian view, which was sort of like the establishment view at the time. And there's a lot of commentary on this in volume 3. So what I'm saying is monetary policy was important to Marx, although it's not a well-known fact. If you are watching the recording, this is a good point to pause because I'm going to go on to chapter 17. And I'm just looking at my watch. This is the point where I get a bit nervous that I'm slightly pressed on time. But I'll tell you, there's something about chapter 17 before we actually get into it. Chapter 17 is very much not a finished editorial product. It's like a collection of notes on the one hand, so bear that in mind. But secondly, the material that Marx looks at here is actually quite complex, I think, and challenging. And thirdly, I think probably I haven't given it enough time to be able to express in a succinct and clear way what I think is going on. But I'll do my best. But we're going to have quite a lot of text. I'm just warning you, and I'm going to jump over some of the text because I haven't really boiled it down yet. But the big thing I want to say here, and I've already been stressing this, is the title is not fully expressing what's going on in this chapter. It is about the circulation of surplus value, but in particular in the form of money. So a lot of Marx's attention centers on money, right? So if you remember, going back to volume 1, around about chapter 24, Marx told us about what he called the capitalization of surplus value, which is the surplus value has been produced goods, commodities are sold, but then the surplus value has to return and accumulate. And of course, when they get to that point, there's two things that can happen. Either the capitalist has got more surplus value now, has got more capital, more money now than when they started with, and they can, because of the surplus value that's returned to them in the money form. Now they can do one or two things with it. They can either reinvest it or they can spend it. You know, I went on about racehorses and yachts quite a lot, okay, because they're particularly bourgeois examples of luxury spending. Okay, now in our earlier example where you've got a very quick turnover, so I think it was 10 in a year, that's a steady revenue for the capitalist to use to spend money. They can buy another racehorse once a month or whatever it is, enhance their yacht. Okay, they got the money, the cash is coming in, they're liquid, right? Whereas capitalist B might well know, okay, at the end of the year, I'm going to get the money. I'm expecting I will sell. There's a risk involved, of course, but on a normal expectation, the commodity will be sold at the end of the year. But they borrow. They borrow in order to spend. Okay, so they have a call on credit, which capitalist A doesn't need to have. And Marx makes a reference back to his sort of, he says it's a bit ambiguous in my thing about fixed and circulating capital. Where do we fit repairs and maintenance? You can make judgments one way or another. He kind of says that basically. And he says, you know, and capitalist accountants do according to what suits them, right? And what he's saying here is that this issue is quite similar. I mean, but what you've got is overall, the issue is this. So what he was talking about before, I should explain this a bit better. Right? He was talking about the repair and maintenance was to do with fixed capital, right? To keep fixed capital working, functioning in a way which is useful to the capitalist, right? Now he's talking about circulating capital. And but again, what the need to maintain the circulating capital continuous in production raises is the need for money to be in reserve, ready to throw into the active production process. So we've got money which is required to replace fixed capital, to maintain fixed capital. We need a further reserve needed to keep the circulating capital, keep paying the wages, keep buying raw materials. And what Marx is now saying is, and the capitalist will want reserve money in terms of his luxury spending, right? As a sort of a hoard from the surplus value. Because this, remember, chapter 16 and 17 is the first time we've actually brought in surplus value. So it's a draw on the surplus value for the capitalist class to consume, right? So what this means is that for the tendency to luxury consumption is also a reason why there may need to be more capital advanced. This is, you know, it's beginning to have a iteration here, a feedback, if you like, between consumption and production, as well as circulation and production, because it's a class issue. So the development of credit is a big theme in what Marx is talking about here. And he does make, again, a distinction really between fixed and circulating capital. You might need credit as a capitalist in order to expand production, but this is sort of new factories, investing in new areas and so on. So that's kind of like mid-term, if you like. But also, you're going to need capital just to keep your factories running until you get paid for the stuff that you've sold. That's for the individual capitalist. Marx then begins to shift more and more into looking at it at a social level, looking at the credit system. I think his argument here isn't terribly clear, I have to say. I mean, he makes points which you can see what the individual points are, but it's not entirely clear what the full argument is. He notes, for example, that when you've got a hoard by an individual capitalist, they might deposit it in the bank, and that means it's lending to another one. But also, so he talks about hoard in that sense. It's like the modern hoard. It's not the old-fashioned usurer. But he also says, but when you get to the level of a nation, then you actually do have hoards because they have to hoard gold. They have to keep gold reserves, right? So what's involved here is also the question of the forms of money. So you've got gold and silver, you've got tokens, which means like national currency and notes and coins, etc. And you've got credit. Okay, so these are different forms physically, if you like, of money, but they also overlap with the different functions of money. So generally speaking, gold and silver are held as national hoards, and they're not used for circulation, for example. Okay. But whatever the form of existence of the extra money capital, it represents, in as much as it is prospective capital, no more than an extra legal titles to the future additional production of the society that the capitalists hold in reserve. This is an interesting point, which again he develops very much in volume 3, right? So money capital is also capitalist money. Okay. So we're no longer just talking about commodity markets, but we're talking about capital markets. Once you talk about commodities as a form of capital, then we're beginning to move towards money capital. And the movement again is towards, okay, but what is capitalist money then? What is capitalist money, right? And this is the movement towards capital markets. It's not just goods being bought and sold, it's effectively capital being bought and sold, right? So there's a heading of simple reproduction. Marx uses this device to move from the sort of single representative case to the totality. He uses it where there's no expansion, but there is a sort of total circular movement. We've seen this already with in volume 1, and he uses it again at the end of volume 2, right? Okay. So up to this point, money has been a given, right? Marx does tell us about how money comes about back in the very beginning of chapter 1 of volume 1. He has a theoretical explanation for money, which makes it co-determinous with the commodity. You can't have one without the other, is basically Marx's argument. But what about capitalist money? Up to now, he's just assumed there's capitalist money available, right? But now he turns his attention to money itself, right? And this is where I think his argument is that I'm not very secure with his argument. Let's put it like that. He then makes the assumption that we'll only look at this problem with the assumption of metallic money, right? So in other words, gold and silver. And the reason that I don't think this works is because he's been talking about pounds all over the place, right? He hasn't been talking about the commodities being sold for ounces of gold. He's been talking about pounds, right? But the thing that he's addressing, and this is part of his, strong intellectual commitment, right, is we can't just assume the money. We have to explain the presence of sufficient money to keep all this circulation going, right? And that's his intellectual honesty, if you like, his scientific commitment. So he starts this exploration by looking at the capitalist production of money. And again, he's looking at metallic money, gold and silver. And it's very striking what he takes out the commodity. He says, well, if you're a gold producer, you're a capitalist gold producer, your commodity is money. It's immediately money in the first instance. So you can forget about C. We've got P produces M dash, production produces more money. That's what it is, right? So it doesn't need to be sold. It's already in the money form. You don't need to convert gold into money. It is money, right? Is his argument. And so it's immediately money capital. So they can, but then he says you can pay the capitalist who's producing this gold pays their workers in gold, right? Because they've already got money. And this is where I'm hovering here, so I'm not quite sure. I'm not convinced by this one, actually. It's the first time in a long time I feel it's unconvincing argument, because he's already been talking about pounds. He hasn't been talking about, I just made this point already, okay? So there needs to be a further mediation, right? It's not a sale, but it is a form of conversion of gold into pounds or gold into dollars or whatever it might be, right? Of one form into another. And Marx is usually very attentive to form. But what is really important, here we are in the middle of an election in the UK, and standard sort of bourgeois election thing is, where does the money come from? You say you're going to spend money on hospitals or defense or whatever. Where does the money come from? Marx asked this question. He says, where does the money come from, right? So you've got surplus value being produced, which means that the output of a capitalist production has got more value than the input. Okay, so there's a certain amount of money has been exchanged for buying the commodities, but there needs to be more money to pay to circulate to pay for the equivalent of the value of the new value, the extra value of the produced commodities. So where does it come from? Where does this money come from? And his argument is really it comes from this metallic production in the end, and he doesn't have any mediation. He says the gold producers produce the extra money. That's his basically his argument at this point in the book. Now, what he does is, while that's his underlying point, as Marx does, he sort of problematizes the existing literature, and he's quite critical of some of the other explanations. And I won't go through all of them, right? But he makes important points on the way, as he always does, right? You have to explain money on the basis of capitalism, and you can't just have a sort of it's always there and now with not a legacy argument, right? And Marx does look at chains of buying and selling, right? And he also, critiques other positions, which I'm not going to go into just really because of time, right? He just keeps coming back to this, what he calls a general problem. It's not the problem of extra money for surplus value. That's not a special problem. He's just saying we need to explain in a capitalist system, where does the money needed in a country for the circulation of commodities come from? Okay. And he introduces a class basis for this understanding. He thinks that if you think of a two-class system of wages for the workers and surplus value at this point coming back to the capitalist, he says, well, basically what the workers spend is a wage advance from the capitalist. And so they're not really the starting point. Capital is the sort of like the initiating agent, right? So it's capital advance, going back to that, to buy the commodities which are either workers, labor time, labor power, or it's the means of production, right? So he's saying this is the point of departure is capital. However, he says it's not quite what you think. He says there's a paradox here, right? And it's actually, you need to think in terms of capitalist class, which is actually the starting point for where the new money. It's not money advanced, which is the starting point, right? It's what the capitalist spends in their luxury production. That's what we have to look at. And this is quite an interesting, and for me, certainly unexpected, unanticipated turn, right? And simple reproduction, by the way, assumes that the capitalist class as a whole consumes all the surplus value. There's no expansion. There's no extra investment in production. That's the whole idea of simple reproduction, right? So the entire surplus value goes on luxury spend. Okay. So if we're looking at where the money comes from, the money has to be sufficient to support this luxury spend, right? And he basically says, well, just as the luxury spend requires more money, so it is in of all capitalists in general, if you like, they're all pumping out surplus value. So there will be a group of capitalists who are busy pumping in the money to pay for this surplus value, and that's the gold producing group of capitalists. And he says that even if they're not in the same country, of course, they have to be then transferred from one country to another, but that's not a significant fact in this analysis. He looks at another red herring, which the only reason I draw your attention to is this quote on page 414, which is actually pretty much in direct contrast to the quote that David Harvey picked out on an earlier page, right? Which he says, well, it's not the case that capitalists can just willy-nilly raise prices. If they could, then they wouldn't be opposed to trade unions. They'd actually encourage trade unions, because by having higher wages, they could have higher prices and make higher profits, right? So he's sort of beginning. It's not a clearly, what's the word, Marx, in his finished work, the argument is a very clearly well-reasoned chain, but this is kind of like snatches, but this gives it a different angle completely than just taking the one side, right? Okay, I think we can skip that as well. Okay, now what he does here is he contrasts money in simple commodity circulation, and I'm sure it's really at the top of your brain. You will remember chapter 3 of volume 1, where he talks about money as the means of circulation in that function money moves. Money doesn't stay still, right? Because one person's got some money, they buy something, and that something is then wanted by somebody else or is consumed. The money moves. I said that wrong, right? The commodities move and then stop, because when they get consumed, but the money keeps moving, right? Follow the money, right? So the money pays for the whiskey. The seller of the whiskey's got the money in hand. They buy a Bible, or maybe the other way around, and so on. The money keeps moving, right? It's always transient, right? He says, so this is also true in a capitalist economy. As a means of circulation, this is also the case, right? Capitalists will need to buy stuff, and the money moves on to the next capitalist and so on, right? But it's not. There's another side to this, right? If we think about our circuits of capital, which we start with money capital, goes through this cycle and ends up again with more money capital, it doesn't wander all over the place, right? It comes back to its starting point. So the question of the turnover of capital affects this both aspects of circulation. It will come back quicker to its starting point the more rapid is the shorter the production period and the circulation period. So the money circulation is affected by the turnover of capital. In fact, it's in both respects, it's affected by the turnover of capital, because it's sort of like an acceleration all the time of how much commodities are being produced, thrown onto the market, the money is needed to pay for them. But there is an important thing that he's beginning to, it's a thread of continuity from volume 1, which is not well signposted, but I actually think it's quite important from volume 1 into volume 3, which is this question of the different functions of money and how they work in the capitalist system. So this is just a question of the accelerated turnover of capital means all the time you're going to need quicker circulation of the money for the surplus value to be realized. Now, this one's interesting, I think, because what he points out here is almost like it's back to the primitive accumulation of capital. And if you remember, Marx comes out of the primitive accumulation of capital with two preconditions in a logical sense for the capitalist mode of production to exist, right? One is the accumulation of wealth as capital on one hand, and ownership, therefore, of the means of production. And the other is that labor is set free, inverted commas. It no longer has, labor no longer has access to the means of production. Now, he's actually pushes this a bit further here, right? He's actually saying something a bit more specific. He's saying that money has to be present. And he actually says, and this is at least tipping his hat towards the significance of colonialism, right? The increased supply of precious metals from the 16th century onwards, conquest of Latin America, India, and so on, and Africa, was a decisive moment in the historical development of capitalist production. Insofar as we are dealing with a further supply of money material needed on the basis of the capitalist mode of production, right? So he's saying having the gold in order to pay for the surplus value, in order to exchange with the surplus value, in order to be the measure of value, is an important historical precondition of capitalist mode of production as well. Okay, and he says this is an ongoing thing. Gold is already money, and I keep coming back to this point, but isn't there further conversion required? And this is also in the primitive accumulation. Marx says these things come into systemic combination in England at the end of the 17th century. But what you have then is the Bank of England, right? Becomes the issuer of money. We're very much nearly at the end. This doesn't add very much. It just provides a good summary. It basically says, when you've got expanded production, what you're going to need is more money. Now, how are you going to get more money of circulation is, well, the system can work more efficiently. I mean, the money can move around more quickly, or you can have sort of netted off payments between, balancing out checks basically by discount banks, or you can shift money out of the savings into circulation. All these things can happen, right? But he says, in the end, underneath all of this, you're going to need more gold. And that's his answer. So he doesn't see this as being a special problem of expanding production, because it's already present as a problem in simple reproduction. He does talk about the difference between sort of a midpoint between everything is reinvested and nothing is spent on luxury consumption. And the other one is that everything is spent on luxury consumption and nothing is reinvested. And he says, obviously, in reality, it's somewhere between the two. Concrete reality is somewhere between the two, right? But he says the question of the hoard is never a purpose in its own right, but it's always a result of the overall purpose of expansion of capital, right? This was an interesting one. The total purchases of the working class are equal to the sum of their wages, i.e. the sum of the variable capital advanced by the entire capitalist class as a whole. This money flows back to the latter through the sale of their product to the working class. So he's thinking in very much here, he's beginning to think at system level of money flows. And this happens to be a very, as Marx links very well, I think, different parts of his argument, generally speaking. And this is a very important link to the next part. So penultimately, I'm just going to contrast Marx with Harvey. I think Marx is addressing a different problem to what Harvey says is happening here, right? I actually think that Marx is addressing the question of the credit system and the supply of money. And I think just as the commodity form develops through capital, so must the money form to keep match with it. I don't think Marx quite spelled all that out, but I think it's there. Now, what Harvey substitutes for this, where does the money come from, is where does the effective demand come from, which is related, but actually a different question. And I think he does render Marx as a sort of neo-Keynesian sort of way, right? It's a very specific interpretation of Marx. So summarizing, chapter 16, I think, is a crucial link forward to volume 3 on the formation of the rate of profit. But I think there is an issue where, once again, we have to think about international trade relations, if we could spell it properly, whether it's between colonized or not, makes quite a big difference. On chapter 17, there is this shift from the individual to the social, is sort of running through it. The question of the money available to purchase commodities, strong connections backwards and forwards in the chapters which deal with money and accumulation, right? I think that it's incomplete what Marx is arguing here. And I think that the interpretation of effective demand is just very one-sided and is present, but it's really not the main point that Marx is getting at. So this is just what we know is going forward. And I'm sorry about it's not as well prepared as all some of my lectures have been. But I think the material is really interesting and really challenging, and I'm quite looking forward to the discussion in the reading group about it. And that's me finished for now. Oh, sorry, you can see the bibliography. It's at the end there. Oh, can I stop share? Yeah. I know I slightly went over time. It's just one of those things. It takes longer to prepare to distill it down, I'm afraid, sometimes.
No worries. Thank you very much, Andy. That was, yeah, there's a lot there, but it's very informative. I enjoyed it. That's brilliant. Right. Okay. Time for discussion, observations, questions, anything you like.
I see Virginia.
Well, okay. Just going back to your discussion of India and the theft on not getting paid for exports and what you were talking about in terms of international trade relations. Well, what in India, in that bit you were talking about there, what did the devolved bosses, if you like, what leverage did they have? What negotiating power did they have? And they must have got paid something, or else how could they have not continued production? So, how did that work? It's a historical question, I suppose.
Yeah, it worked slightly different in different phases, but they didn't have to be paid. They just got robbed twice. I mean, the Patniak book is very good on this, actually. This was Capital and Imperialism, and it's in the bibliography there. I mean, the British made people pay taxes, and when the Indian goods were sold, they didn't pay. They paid for those goods out of some of the taxes that people had paid them already. Okay.
Internally
But
within it.
also when they did sell the goods, circulate them internationally, there was a big thing in England called the re-export trade, right? So they'd import Indian commodities and then send them around the empire. And they would say, okay, well, they're ours now. So we'll keep the money. Thank you very much. So that was a second robbery. I mean, I've just picked this up from a fairly quick reading of Patniak's book, but I think they're quite convincing in what they're saying. So I highly recommend that. And it's a lot. There is a tradition going back to the 19th century, which rather than others will know much better than I do, the so-called drain theory. So I mean, there were Indian thinkers, Indian sort of representatives, if you like, articulating you are taking all of this and you're not giving us anything back. But it does go through different periods. That's quite important because after Marx's writing in the last third of the 19th century, there's a big investment in India from Britain in cotton production. And that's, if you like, the modern imperialism, the export of capital, because Indian labor was so cheap. So they could put their factories in India and produce very quick. I mean, up to that time, what we're talking about is sort of more artisanal production, which was exported from India.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much for that, Virginia. So I can see that Pamela has put up an electronic hand. So over to you, Pamela. I can't see you. Can you? All right.
Hey.
Oh, now I can. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, no, I just wondered if you could so spell the name of that Indian or put it in the chat and the book, please.
Yeah, it's in the bibliography at the end of my presentation, which
Okay, that's all right. Thank you.
sent you.
So one thing that struck me about what you just was saying, Andy, is that is it not the case that these taxes in India that had to be paid in sterling? So you had to find some way or other of getting your hands on pound sterling in order to pay the taxes, which obviously locks you into an economy. You can't sort of bypass that. You actually have to generate not just the money to pay the taxes, but specifically the money in the form of pound sterling to pay the taxes. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm not sure actually. I don't know. I would check that. It might well be right. I mean, it does sound like a typical trick they would play, but
yeah. So you can't sort of opt out, as it were. You sort of it's rather cunning.
I mean,
I'm sort of ignorant of this really, but I just remember very well Eric Hobsbawm, who I like very much, in Industry and Empire, and he makes this point, which that basically the cotton manufacturing industry in England, the UK, destroyed the cotton manufacturing industry, which in India, which actually existed. It's sort of one of the aspects of colonialism that you were talking about is in order to transform India into sort of a producer of raw materials for the English cotton industry, you actually have to destroy the indigenous cotton industry, which already existed in India. And that's exactly what happened, he says, and which is a quite striking thing, I think.
Absolutely. So there's another good writer on this. I forgot to put it in the bibliography. I agree with you completely about Hobsbawm on this. It's a guy called Inikori, who's actually, I think, a Nigerian. And what he does is he traces how the British used Indian cotton goods in the empire. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Yeah, I can. Virginia, you got your hand up, but not electronically. You're just sort of waving. But that's okay.
I don't want to ask a question again if somebody else has a question to ask. But
well, Richard does, but you're here, so go on. Yep, that's fine.
Joe, just going back to Andy, you were saying about the last third of the 19th century and sort of going from, as I assume you were saying, artisanal to capitalist exploitation of a different kind. Well, what was the coincidence then between the end of the American Civil War and the cotton production shifting around for a period of time between where cotton was produced and I'm asking for sort of his historical description what that event and its effect on cotton. And I know from from Beckert that certain aspects of increasing cotton production in India during slavery in America were attempted by the British, but they gave it up. It wasn't as productive as in America. And then afterwards, things changed, things shifted about, not just India. But do you have any sort of thoughts on that in terms of what you were saying earlier about the last third of the 19th century? Sorry if that's a complicated question.
No, it's interesting point. I mean, you're quite right. I mean, it is. I mean, and Becker's book is good, although he's an economic historian rather than, if you like, a theorist, I would say. But he covers the ground quite well. And I think the British ended up a lot in Egypt because they had less cotton from the US and they didn't think the Indian cotton was the right type and so on and so forth. But they, the urge to secure sources was there. And I think a lot of production shifted to Egypt from memory. It is a fact that 70% of the cotton picked in the world today is still done by hand.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just incredibly labor intensive still.
Mm-hmm. Richard?
Hi, thanks. I can't remember who it's attributed to, but there's an argument that sort of dates the start of capitalism, the turning point, to a combination of enclosures and securing stealing the gold off the Spanish, during that time. So given that this chapter seems to say gold production is really important, that seems like to give weight to that argument. But you seem like slightly unsure of that argument that he's making. Is it just because you don't see the mediation? Is that your worry, or are you worried about the idea that, well, all the money originally just came from digging it up? That seems it seems like it is surprising and possibly a little bit like, couldn't think of anything. It's just the gold dug out the ground. Especially, and then okay, I know that's about the initial conditions, but now it's all fake believe and fiat. It's not really. Well, I mean, they're still digging up gold, but we lost the gold standard or that sort of thing ages ago, didn't we? And so, was it only important then and it's no longer important, or is that argument about gold being the source of money possibly just a bit dodgy?
I trust Marx, obviously, but I just think that these are, slightly sketched notes. So I think he's got insights, but it doesn't all hang together for me. So, I mean, even in volume 1, part 1, to be honest with you, he starts with gold. Yeah, as you need a universal equivalent. That's what he's saying. You have to have money. If you're going to have markets, you've got to have money, right? You can't. What do you pay for with stuff, right? How do you measure value? So he's saying there's this unique commodity which gets selected to become the representative of value, and precious metals are well suited to play that role. But there has to be something, right? So he's got a very strong, cogent argument there. And then in chapter 3 of volume 1, when he starts writing about money, to me it's the most, foreign area of knowledge, right? It's not something that one normally knows about, right? But he does go into it, and he splits the functions of money. You think, why would you be worried about different functions of money, right? And it actually becomes quite important. But he's kind of like on the cusp here, right? Because in chapter 3 of volume 1, it's sort of like he starts writing about money, not really the way he talked about commodities before, right? It's sort of like early modern period. If you think the historical examples he's taking, right? And for me, this is the logical necessity of the capitalist state, in actual fact, right? And so, because you got to convert gold into pounds, shillings, and pence. So who's going to do that? Who's going to decide? So it doesn't have to be fixed. It was fixed for a very long time. The ratio, 4.2 pounds to 1 ounce of gold, I think it was, or something like that, right? For a very long time, for 200 or 300 years. It can be floating, and in a modern economy, it has to be floating. But there has to be that relation, because all the way through Marx's book, he's telling us that, well, the value of these commodities is £100, £110. He's not telling us it's 100 ounces of gold, right? So there is a change of form. And normally Marx is very good. We saw it so meticulous in terms of the circuit of capital, and going back to the commodity again, he really does analyze the form itself. And I just think he's got glimpses of it. He's got the elements of it, but I don't see the same focus on, to the same degree, on the money form as it's developed in modern capitalism, right? There's a lot of very interesting stuff again in volume 3. He's working towards it. It's just like, the guy died. He should have lived to be 200 years old, shouldn't he? And he could have told us all of this, right? But that's what I'm trying to say. It's not that he's wrong. It's just that it does look unfinished to me. Yeah.
Thank you. Andreas.
Just one additional comment. Thanks a lot, Andy, for yet again an excellent lecture to the example of Egypt and cotton. And so I think Egypt is quite an interesting example, because on the one hand, of course, Britain tried to source cotton in Egypt, especially after the civil war in the US. And on the other hand, they used Egypt as a way of getting rid of overproduction, because they sold lots of machinery precisely for cotton growing to Egypt. And the way of how they did it was that they also provided Egypt with the loans, with which then Egypt could buy the British machinery. And so, of course, they soon ran into problems. I think Luxembourg describes it, yeah. And so they had to extend loans, and eventually the British troops marched in and took over the country to secure that. So it's quite interesting how this kind of securing of raw material was then linked to industrial production, but also to money as a commodity, and the question of loans and credit. And in a way, that example brings those dimensions together, also touched upon in your lecture today.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know. Personally, I don't know how to. My knowledge is not, encyclopedic, and what you say makes an awful lot of sense. I think it's right.
This comment that you made about the gold standard, standing for several hundred years, it is actually quite important, isn't it? If you think about the political implications of this, my recollection of this sort of the Labour government of 1929 was basically a political response to sort of the crisis in the economy associated with currency and moving off the gold standard. So actually, these are processes in the field of political economy which have direct political consequences, which is obviously of interest, I think, to anybody who's a Marxist. Another example would be, I don't know, I used to give lectures on the English Revolution, the politics of the Revolution, and the political economy background to all of that is basically Tudor inflation. So that you're talking about the crisis of the aristocracy, as Lawrence Stone would say, associated with inflation of 700–800% over the course of the 16th century, often attributed to the importation of Spanish gold, and the impact that had on the various strata, class system of English society, and the abilities of some people to cope better than others with the consequences of that. So again, this is sort of abstract economic theory in a way, but it has clearly, historically, very direct social and political implications, and that's not difficult to establish that, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I'm feeling this is a bit tentative. Okay, I'm not quite sure when the gold standard was started, because I was looking at it in terms of the transatlantic cotton trade, and they would often say that cotton would sell at 10 cents a pound at the plantation gate, whatever, at New Orleans, that type of thing, on the way out, and then it would be like 7 pence a pound coming into Liverpool. So I just wanted to look at the exchange conversion rates, and what I found is that time, anyway, both the dollar and the pound had a fixed ratio against gold. So therefore, by definition, they had a fixed ratio with each other. So you could work out what, how many cents was a penny, and all that. Turned out to be more or less the same, actually. It was quite odd, because you had 240 pence in a pound and 100 cents in a dollar. And anyway, so, or no, it was half, exactly half. But what I'm trying to get at is, this was capitalist stability. That relationship was the New York, Liverpool, London axis was probably the most stable international trade relationship of the 19th century. And it took a while to get there. And yeah, there is stuff in, I mean, your historical knowledge is deeper than mine, but just from reading Capital, right, you've got this thing where Marx says, well, capitalist farmers did well out of the discovery of gold in Latin America, or the robbery of gold in Latin America, right? Because they were the inflation worked well for them, because they were paying wages at one level and selling on another price, right? So they reaped a profit through no effort of their own whatsoever, and that bolstered the capitalist class in England, and it was completely sort of like a circulation effect, right? So already it was quite interconnected, and that would have been exactly that period, sort of 16th into the 17th century, I guess.
Sure. Okay. So, do we have any more?
I'd like to. I find the chapter 16 quite helpful, and I've got I've got a thesis on it. I've got an argument about that. I found and then I found the chapter 17 a lot more kind of like, oh wow, things are really opening up here, and where do we go? I'm not quite sure yet. Yeah.
So I guess there is an issue, basically, from what you said about the incompleteness of some of the arguments that about the actual status of the text of Capital Volume 2. I know you've mentioned this before, haven't you? Obviously, Volume 1 was published in Marx's lifetime, and Volumes 2 and 3 later. And so there are issues relating to actually the sort of integrity of the text, I think, and particularly the influence of Engels as an editor. And I seem to remember I don't know where I was reading this, but in some cases, some of the chapters of the later volumes, all you had was a chapter heading, and the entire chapter was actually written by Engels, sort of added by him based on his knowledge of what Marx he thinks Marx would have said, and having gotten around to writing the chapter. So there is an issue, isn't there, of that kind, I think.
Yeah, and that's exactly on the area, this question of turnover. So chapter 4 in volume 3, Engels wrote, and I think he was completely right to do it, because, following, I would say, I'm kind of like Engels plus, this is an important argument, right? Rate of profit relies on 3 things, and turnover is one of them.
Sure.
Because it affects the capital advance. It affects how much capital needs to go in order to get a certain amount of profit out. So yeah, he was completely right to do it. I actually think he makes a slight mistake in his execution, but come on, I mean, the point, the intention was completely right.
Sure, there's an interesting issue here, I think, because there's been debate, hasn't there, about the Marx-Engels relationship, and there is a tendency in some of the literature which discusses that generally to say, well, look, we shouldn't assume that they agreed with one another on all subjects, and often some of the things, for some people anyway, the undesirable things which are associated with Marx and Marxism actually derived from Engels rather than from Marx. So that's a general tendency in the literature, and my understanding of the literature specifically on Marx's economic writings is that's carried over into that. So sometimes people have suggested that when it comes to strictly the economic theory, that some of the ideas which are associated with Marx are actually those of Engels, and there shouldn't be, and that somehow or other Engels distorted Marx, or as an interpreter of Marx is suspect, and so on, and so forth. So there's a sort of a politics to all of that, I think. There is an issue about the interpretation of text there, and but I get the impression from what you've been saying that actually you're quite sympathetic to the idea that Engels understood Marx very well, actually, when it comes to the economic theory, as it were. This issue of distortion doesn't really arise there, I think.
Yeah, 80%. Yes, there are some particular issues. I mean, Engels had a historical view, so his historical sense is sometimes good, but occasionally it gets in the way of the sort of the more system critique thing that Marx also had. So most of the time he's he's fine.
He does actually. Yeah, yeah. Okay, thank you. Sorry, Tim, I've just noticed you got your hand up. You've been waiting patiently, so over to you.
This is new territory for me largely, and I really appreciate Andy's overview. But I'd like to ask Andy if he'd just spend a moment talking through the references that you've suggested, only one or two of which I'm already familiar with, in terms of why you've chosen them, what they particularly add. Perhaps, I mean, I've read Suzanne Brunhoff, but not DeMarco or Kostas Lapavitsas. So, could you comment on the particular reasons that you've chosen those particular texts?
Yeah.
If
Okay.
that's not irrelevant for other people.
Yeah. Some of them I'm sketchy on. Some of them I got better knowledge of. Right. Again, it's just because of preparation time for this particular lecture. Broadbury and Gupta are very interesting. They're not Marxist, but they've got a good sense of economic history again. And the different shifts we were talking earlier about. When imports from India to England and then vice versa, and that's what they look at. Suzanne de Brunhoff is the sort of, for the last two generations now, the classic text Marx on money. I'm not quite sure about it now because of the work we're looking at now, but she does understand that you've got to have a capitalist money as well as sort of like simple commodity money. Now, I can't remember. I haven't read all of these, to be honest. I've looked at them very quickly. So maybe we should also, I recognise my own limits at the moment. I'm busy electioneering at the moment. I have read quite closely David Harvey, and I do think I challenge his interpretation, basically. That's where I'm headed. Yeah, and I think Mandel is quite good on this. The points I don't particularly agree with a lot of the points in his instruction, to be honest, right? Because I think he's obsessed with fixed capital, as Harvey is, right? And don't look enough at circulating capital, which I think is a tendency of sort of, I have to say it, Eurocentric Marxism, right? They don't think so much about raw materials and their provision. But on the points on these chapters, I think he's actually quite good. Yeah, so I don't know. I can't tell you much about Dantas. I think I read the abstract and thought it was in the right area, and the same with Lapavitsas, to be honest. Yeah, there's Bill Jeffries. I do know his stuff, right? And he's he's more of an economist and a bit empirical. There's conceptual issues, I think, but I don't want to be too critical of him because I like his empirical stuff, actually. Yeah, most of the rest of Mosley stuff I know very well, actually, and I think Fred Mosley's take on all of this, I don't agree with either, because I think he confuses distribution of surplus value with the conversion of surplus value into the form of profit. And I think he's got a very standard, which is wrong, understanding of the transformation problem, but he's not alone in that. It's most of the literature, in my view, is wrong. So yeah, I can't really tell you too much about the others. I'd have to go back to them, which is not, which means that what I'm admitting is I'm not on top of this material. I'm just sort of like encountering it as well.
Well,
no, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, it is. That's great. Right, well, I think we're out of time. That was really interesting, Andy. Thank you very much.
Brilliant.
Yeah,
exactly. I think it's really thought-provoking. I agree.
It is. An eye-opener. Right, okay, well, we got to stop because we're out of time.
Okay.
Thank you very much indeed. And yes, thank you in the usual manner. Sort of, I don't know.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you,
Andy.
What
I want, yeah, thank you. What I want to know is, where does the money come from?
Where does the money come from? Show me the money. Yeah, exactly. Next time. Okay, bye.
Right.
all the best to you all.
Yeah.